The hood descended like a heavy curtain, and the world was instantly reduced to the smell of coarse, unwashed linen and the sound of his own frantic breathing. In that suffocating dark, Samuel did not find terror. He found a ghost. As his fingers traced the space where the fabric met his jaw, he was no longer a man standing in a midnight clearing. He was a boy again, hidden in the tall grass, watching a rope bite into the weathered flesh of his father's neck. That memory arrived not as a scream, but as a cold, crystalline clarity. When the men around him called him brother, they believed they were welcoming a new recruit into their sanctuary of white-robed supremacy. They did not realize they were inviting a ledger into their midst. For 8 seconds, while the torchlight outside carved ghost maps onto the cotton of his mask, Samuel allowed his own pulse to steady into a rhythm of iron. He ceased to be the prey and began the metamorphosis into the hunter. He would learn to speak their dialect of vitriol, he would mimic their posture of unearned pride, and he would keep his true name tucked like a jagged stone beneath his tongue. The deadliest secret of the night was not the identity hidden by the mask. It was the terrifying truth that men see only what they are programmed to expect. They looked at the hood and saw a comrade. They failed to see the man who had spent a lifetime learning to translate their silence into the architecture of their coming ruin. The men standing in that jagged circle were not the monsters of distant myth. They were the mundane, daily pillars of the county. Beneath those peaked hoods were the eyes of the sheriff who had perfected the art of looking away from blood, the banker who traded in the currency of foreclosure and grief, and the preacher who used the pulpit to sanctify a social order built on bone. Whiteness, for them, was not merely a skin tone. It was a uniform of absolute impunity. Samuel had been raised to read these faces long before he could read a primer. His mother, a woman who treated literacy as if it were contraband, had taught him his letters by the flickering, desperate light of a tallow candle hidden beneath the floorboards. She whispered the alphabet like a spell for liberation, teaching him that words could feed a mind even when the scorched fields failed to feed a family. When the Union soldiers had marched through, they brought the word freedom on signed parchment, but the physical ground remained hard and the hearts of the defeated remained cold. Freedom without the means to sustain it was a cruel, hollow rumor. Samuel realized early that survival required a more dangerous craft. The ability to decipher the truth hidden behind the Sunday sermons and the small, drunken admissions made by neighbors in the shadows of the saloon. He understood that while laws may change overnight, the habits of the heart endure for generations. In the quiet, stagnant corners of Lown County, these men did not call their gatherings an insurgency. They called them concerns for civilization. They met as self-appointed guardians of a private religion where the liturgy was violence and the communion was ash. They burned the meeting houses of the freedmen and wrote obituaries that masked deliberate murder as unfortunate misadventure. When Moses, the local teacher, was found charred and broken outside the schoolhouse, the official report read like a tragic accident of fate. The town resumed its business immediately, a collective machine of pretending. Samuel watched this machinery of denial with a patience that was often mistaken for submission. He knew there were 2 distinct kinds of courage. The one that leaps heroically into the fire, and the one that waits for the fire to burn itself down to embers. Samuel chose the latter, not because he loved the wait, but because he had seen what spectacle brought. It only resulted in louder mourning and stronger ropes. He committed himself to a slow, lethal calculus. He understood that to dismantle a secret society, one does not batter the walls from the outside with blunt force. One drowns it from within. You let its own inherent paranoia become the salt that poisons the well. This required him to become something unimaginable to them, not the freedman tending 23 acres of hard-won soil, but a man they would accept as a peer. To achieve this, he invented Simon Vance, a man constructed entirely of grit and perceived grievance. Simon was a poor transplant from North Carolina, a man supposedly hardened by losses to carpetbaggers and bitter about the shifting tectonic plates of the post-war world. Samuel practiced this new skin until it fit his skeleton as naturally as his own. He trained his jaw to hold the flat, hard vowels of the Piedmont and schooled his posture into the slouched, heavy contempt of a man who feels he has been robbed of a birthright. He taught himself the small, casual cruelties that passed for humor among men who used mockery as proof of their own belonging. He began to haunt the spaces where white men gathered, the tobacco shops, the courthouse steps. and the dim, smoke-filled backrooms of the saloons. He sat in the silence of those rooms until the silence turned into an invitation. White men, he discovered, loved nothing more than the sound of their own grievances. They needed an audience for their myths of victimhood. Samuel became that perfect audience. He listened, he nodded with the right amount of bitterness, and he memorized the rhythm of their rituals. He waited for the inevitable moment they would offer him the robe. When it finally came, his hands trembled, not with the weakness of fear, but with the electric anticipation of a man finally reaching for the lever of a trap. Under the hood for the first time as Samuel did not pray. He catalogued. He mapped the voices of the merchant, the deputy, the landowner, and the doctor with the precision of a cartographer. He committed every detail to the hidden ledger of his mind. Who held a grudge over a disputed boundary line, who coveted a neighbor's property, and who among them had the weakest stomach for the blood they claimed to crave in their speeches. He heard them plan the legal ruin of a schoolhouse and the psychological trickery required to dispossess those who refused to bow. Their words were precise because they believed the hoods provided an absolute divine shield. Samuel recorded those precisions with the intensity of an accountant preparing for an audit. He was gathering names, dates, and locations, transforming their smoke-lit sins into a document more dangerous than any rifle. To succeed, he had to swallow the bile of their insults and swear oaths upon a Bible he refused to honor in their company. He had to kneel before their burning crosses while secretly calculating how to use that same light to illuminate their crimes for the world to see. At night, he would return home to kiss the head of his young son, Daniel, and watch his wife, Clara, sleep, holding his new identity like a hidden blade. This was his apprenticeship in deception, a total commitment to becoming the rot that would eventually bring the structure down. The intimacy of this betrayal was his heaviest burden. To be trusted by a conspirator is to hold a fragile, volatile currency, and Samuel began to trade in it with a cold efficiency. He volunteered for the night rides, not to inflict pain, but to ensure he was there to document who led the charge and who held the torch. He provided the alibis and the small strategic lies that the others accepted as undeniable proof of his loyalty to the cause. Each time he proved himself reliable. Their collective suspicions about the outsiders softened, and Samuel's influence within the circle multiplied like a silent infection. Yet, there was a profound danger in this intimacy. Hatred is a language that can be learned, but it often corrodes the speaker from the inside out. Samuel had to constantly resist being seduced by the raw, intoxicating feeling of power that came with the robe. The easy laughter of the group when a noose was mentioned as a joke could become a siren song of belonging. To counter this, he kept his ledger close and his true purpose closer. That ledger would do more than paper was ever intended to do. It would translate their secret crimes into public proof. It would allow him to pry open the lid of their impunity and force the county to see what the law had long refused to acknowledge. He was a man standing on a bridge between two worlds, and he knew that for the bridge to hold, he had to be the strongest timber in the fire. The transition from the shadow of the hood back to the soft, flickering warmth of his own hearth was a nightly ritual of psychological dislocation. As Simon Vance, he was a loud, bitter man whose laughter was a jagged edge. As Samuel, he was a ghost walking through his own life. The slow calculus demanded that he inhabit the skin of his enemies so completely that he began to recognize the very scent of their fear. He realized that the psychology of the mob is not built on strength, but on an agonizingly fragile need for validation. They did not gather to exert power so much as to reassure one another that they still possessed it. In the quiet hours before dawn, Samuel would sit in his barn, the silence of the wood pressing against him, and record the day's observations in his mental ledger. He was no longer just a witness, he was a mapmaker of their insecurities. He knew which men drank to forget the faces of those they had wronged, and which ones clung to the robe because without it, they were merely failing farmers with nothing to their names but debt and dust. He practiced the Simon persona until the mask no longer felt like a costume, but like a second skin that threatened to graft itself to his soul. The true test of his commitment arrived on a night when the air felt like damp wool, heavy with the scent of impending rain. The target was Abraham Jones, a freedman whose only crime was the audacity to believe that a deed to 40 acres of red clay made him a citizen. To the League, Abraham's prosperity was a silent insult, a direct challenge to the natural order they had sworn to protect. Hutchkins, a man whose cruelty was as casual as his stride, led the ride that night, his torch bobbing through the pines like a predatory star. When they reached the small, sturdy house Abraham had built with his own hands, the circle formed, a ring of white ghosts in the dark. Samuel, standing among them as Simon, felt the cold weight of the torch in his palm. He watched as Abraham emerged, his hands raised in a gesture of supplication that mirrored Samuel's father decades prior. To maintain his cover, to protect the larger mission of systemic destruction, Samuel had to do the unthinkable. When Hutchkins gave the nod, a silent command to prove his loyalty, Samuel stepped forward. He watched the orange flames lick the side of Abraham's barn, the dry timber catching with a roar that drowned out the screams of the livestock. In that moment, he wasn't just Simon Vance. He was the very instrument of the terror he sought to dismantle, a paradox of necessary evil that tasted like ash in his throat. The ride home was a blur of backslapping and hollow boasts. The men celebrated the lesson they had taught, oblivious to the fact that the man riding beside them was silently cataloguing their every word. When Samuel finally dismounted at his own farm, the adrenaline collapsed into a physical sickness. He retreated to the darkness behind his barn and vomited, his body revolting against the role his mind forced it to play. Clara found him there, a silent shadow against the barn wood. She did not ask for details. She simply placed a hand on his trembling shoulder, her presence a grounding wire for his fracturing identity. "I am inside now," he whispered, his voice cracking with the strain of the night. "They trust me." That trust was the key to the vault, but the cost was a piece of his humanity that he feared he might never get back. He realized then that infiltration is a form of slow-motion suicide. You kill the man you were to become the weapon you need to be. The ledger in his mind was growing heavier, filled now with the names of men who laughed while a neighbor's livelihood turned to smoke. But he knew he needed more than names. He needed the source of their authority. The breakthrough came in February of 1885, a month of bone-chilling frost and long, deceptive shadows. Samuel had managed to gain access to the private study of Richard Peaton, the man the League called their exalted Cyclops. Peaton was a man of elegant cruelty, a former plantation overseer who had translated his mastery of the lash into a mastery of local politics. Under the guise of delivering a shipment of tobacco, Samuel found himself alone in Peaton's office for 10 minutes. 10 minutes that would rewrite his destiny. He bypassed the desk and went straight for the heavy oak cabinet where Peaton kept his records. There, tucked behind stacks of legal land deeds, was a weathered ledger bound in cracked leather. It was a correction book, a meticulous record of every act of violence committed in the county since 1870. As Samuel flipped through the pages by the dim light of a single candle, his eyes landed on an entry from April 1863. The name Thomas Gaines stared back at him, followed by the clinical notation, "Property justice served, Overseer R. Peaton." Thomas Gaines was his father's name. The man who sat across from him at meetings, the man who called him brother, was the same man who had tied the knot that broke his family. The discovery transformed Samuel's mission from a quest for justice into a prophecy of retribution. He realized that Peaton didn't just lead the League, he used it as a tool to manage his own historical debts. The ledger was a map of his father's murder and dozens of others, all neatly categorized as if they were business transactions. Samuel spent the next hour, risking discovery with every passing second, copying the most damning entries onto thin scraps of paper hidden in his boots. He understood now that he didn't just need to expose the League, he needed to make them tear themselves apart from the center out. He would use their own hierarchy as a lever. He began by planting the seeds of financial paranoia. During a late-night gathering at the saloon, he leaned in close to Hutchkins and whispered a calculated lie about Peaton skimming the League's dues to pay off his own mounting gambling debts. "I saw the receipts myself," he muttered with the flat, bitter certainty of Simon Vance. He watched as the seed took root, the flicker of doubt crossing Hutchkins' face. In a secret society, trust is the only currency, and Samuel had just started devaluing it. By the end of the week, the atmosphere within the League had shifted from one of smug unity to one of clandestine suspicion. Samuel watched with a cold, detached fascination as the men began to eye each other with new intensity. He amplified the rot by introducing the idea of a traitor, At the next meeting, standing in the center of the clearing, he mentioned hearing rumors that one of their brothers had been seen speaking with a federal agent from Montgomery. He didn't name a name. He didn't have to. Paranoia is a self-sustaining fire. It only needs a draft to grow. Every man in that circle began to mentally audit his neighbors, looking for the small tells of betrayal. Samuel stood among them, his hood masking a face of absolute calm, watching as the brotherhood began to fracture into a collection of terrified individuals. He was no longer just Simon Vance. He was the architect of their collapse, a man who had learned that the strongest locks are broken from the inside. The stage was set for the fire, but before the flames could rise, he had one final account to settle with Richard Peaton. The air in March 1885 carried a peculiar electric weight, the kind of silence that precedes a tectonic shift. In Loudest County, the atmosphere was no longer thick with the smug certainty of the League. It was brittle, vibrating with a jagged, inward-facing fear. Samuel spent the final weeks leading up to the spring equinox preparing the ground, both literally and figuratively. He had mapped the clearing behind Hannesville with the obsessive detail of a master engineer, identifying the exact pressure points where the intersection of geography and psychology would yield the most devastating collapse. Under the cover of darkness, he had buried small, calculated powder charges in a concentric ring beneath the damp earth of the meeting site. These were not intended for mass slaughter, but for a specific brand of theatrical terror, a way to turn the earth itself into a witness against the men who claimed to own it. He had also modified a hollowed-out Bible, the same one he used to swear his false oaths, to act as a remote ignition source. As he stood on the porch of his home on the evening of March 14th, he watched the sun dip below the horizon, feeling the transition from Samuel to the Ash brother finalize within his marrow. He left the deed to his land on the kitchen table, a final anchor for Clara and Daniel, and rode toward the woods, knowing that tonight the masks would finally melt. The clearing was already alive with the flickering orange tongues of 30 torches when Samuel arrived. The men cheered for Brother Simon, their voices sounding forced, a collective attempt to drown out the gnawing suspicion that had hollowed out their ranks over the past month. Richard Peaton stood at the center, his posture rigid, his eyes darting across the hooded faces as if searching for the invisible rot Samuel had planted. The ceremony began with a sermon of mythological purity, a desperate reassertion of the natural law they believed was under siege. Peaton spoke of cleansing the county, of an eternal flame that would restore their lost glory. Samuel stepped forward, the modified Bible clutched in his hand, and placed it at the foot of the massive wooden cross that stood as the axis of their world. He lit the base of the cross as was his assigned duty, watching the flames climb the kerosene-soaked timber. As Peaton reached the crescendo of his oath, demanding that the brothers swear their lives to the cause, Samuel stepped back into the shadows and pressed the hidden trigger beneath his thumb. The ground did not just shake, it erupted in a synchronized, deafening roar that tore the clearing apart, sending a ring of white-hot fire upward like a curtain of judgment. The explosion was a masterclass in psychological shattering. It wasn't just the physical shock, it was the total betrayal of the environment they believed they controlled. The ring of fire trapped the men within their own circle, the heat instantly igniting the dry, starched fabric of several robes. The clearing became a chaotic theater of screams and silhouettes, the smoke thickening into a black shroud that smelled of sulfur and burning cotton. Through the haze, Samuel did not run. He stood his ground, his own hood half consumed by a stray spark, revealing a face that was as calm as a tombstone. He found Peaton crawling through the dirt, his fine coat singed, his eyes wide with the primal realization that his divinity was a lie. Samuel knelt beside him, the roar of the burning cross providing a backdrop to a voice that had regained its true, ancestral weight. "You once tied a knot for a man named Thomas Gaines because he dared to read," Samuel whispered, the words cutting through Peaton's panicked gasps. The recognition that flickered in Peaton's eyes was not a moment of repentance, but of total, soul-crushing terror. He realized that the brother he had trusted was the ghost of his own past, come to collect a debt that had been compounding for 22 years. By the time the sun rose over Loudest County, the clearing was a blackened scar, a hollowed-out memory of the men who had gathered there. The local newspapers, ever the architects of convenient fiction, labeled the event the Hannesville misfortune. They claimed a freak lightning strike had ignited a pine tree, which in turn set the meeting ground ablaze. It was an elegant, necessary lie, one that allowed the surviving members of the town's elite to bury their trauma under a veneer of divine will. The sheriff, whose own son had been wounded in the blast, signed the reports with a trembling hand, never once mentioning the ledger or the man who had vanished into the smoke. But among the cabins and the small holdings of the freedmen, a different story took root. They whispered of the Ash Brother, a figure who had walked through fire to reclaim the names of the lost. This legend became a silent currency of hope, a reminder that secrecy is a double-edged sword. Samuel Vance was never seen in Lown County again, but his absence left a permanent vacuum in the power structure. The fire hadn't just destroyed a meeting place, it had burned away the illusion of untouchable power, leaving behind a legacy of whispered truth that would wait, like an ember in the soil, for the next generation to breathe it back into life. The decades following the Hannesville fire saw a transformation of power that was as subtle as it was absolute. In Alabama, the physical terror of the Night Riders did not vanish, it simply retreated into the architecture of the state itself. The men who had once gathered in the woods now convened in Mahogany Road boardrooms and courthouse chambers, trading their linen hoods for silk ties and their torches for the cold, efficient authority of the gavel. This was the evolution of the mask. The system realized that brute force created martyrs, but bureaucracy created amnesia. By the turn of the century, the Ash Brother had been relegated to the status of a tall tale, a ghost story told by those who had nothing else left to bequeath their children. The official records of Lown County began to develop surgical gaps. Files associated with the 1885 misadventure were not burned. That would have been too conspicuous. Instead, they were reclassified or lost in the strategic shuffling of archives. It was a lesson in institutional survival. The most effective way to kill a revolution is to deny that it ever happened. The narrative of the South was being scrubbed clean, polished into a myth of lost causes and noble heritage, while the charred remains of the truth were buried beneath layers of administrative silence. In 1931, Daniel Vance, now living under the sterile alias of Daniel Carter, returned to the red clay of Alabama. He was a man shaped by the slow calculus his father had pioneered, a railroad engineer who understood that the smallest vibration could eventually bring down a mountain. He did not come for blood, he came for the paper. Daniel realized that while his father had used fire to reveal the rot, the modern era required a different kind of light, the light of the archive. He haunted the courthouse under the guise of a genealogical researcher, watching the clerks with a predator's patience. He noticed the psychology of the gatekeeper, the way they hesitated at certain names, the way their eyes flickered toward a specific cabinet in the back room marked with a red seal. One night, armed with his father's old Bible and a lantern, he bypassed the locks of history. He found a file marked Restricted State Order, 1885-47. Inside was a single telegram from the Bureau of Investigation that laid bare the entire conspiracy. The fire was to be labeled an accident to prevent racial unrest and political leverage. This was the smoking gun of the erasure, a formal government-stamped directive to lie to the future. The system's defense mechanism was swift and predictable. When Daniel managed to leak fragments of these documents to a sympathetic journalist in Chicago, the response was not a public inquiry, but a coordinated silencing. The Great Depression provided the perfect atmospheric noise. A nation struggling for bread had little appetite for the ghosts of 1885. The local newspapers in Alabama dismissed the reports as agitation, a word used to invalidate any truth that threatened the comfort of the status quo. The clerk who had inadvertently helped Daniel was found dead in the river, his passing labeled a misadventure, a chilling echo of the language used decades earlier. Daniel was forced to flee, realizing that the fire his father lit was being smothered by a blanket of systemic indifference. He understood then that power does not just control the present, it claims ownership of the past. If you can control what a people remember, you can dictate what they are capable of imagining for their future. He passed the fragments of the ledger to his own son, not as a story of victory, but as a map of an ongoing war, a war fought over the very definition of reality. By the 1960s, the legend of Samuel Vance underwent a strange symbolic inversion. As civil rights activists marched through the heat of the Alabama sun, the image of the man who burned the Klan from within began to appear on the walls of segregated neighborhoods. He had become a secular saint of the resistance, a figure that the state desperately tried to re-mask. Academic institutions, funded by the descendants of the men in Samuel's ledger, actively suppressed any research into the Hannesville fire. Dr. Elena Parks, a researcher who attempted to document the oral histories of the survivors, found her career dismantled within weeks. The university didn't ban her work, they simply defunded it, citing a lack of credible sourcing. This was the modern face of the Klan, a polite academic denial that wore the robes of scholarly rigor. They understood that facts are meaningless if they are denied the platform of legitimacy. The erasure was nearly complete, a century of silence reinforced by the very institutions meant to preserve the truth. The final act of Part 4 begins in 1985, exactly 100 years after the clearing went up in flames. Malcolm Vance, Samuel's great-grandson, discovered the original rusted metal box buried beneath the foundation of a demolished records building. Inside, the 43 pages of the ledger remained, the ink now a deep, dried blood brown. It was a manifesto of accountability, listing the ancestors of the current elite who still ruled the state. Malcolm did not go to the newspapers. He went to the copy machines. He realized that in an age of emerging technology, the only way to protect the truth was to make it infinite. He mailed copies to every historical society, every library, and every political office in the country. He thought he had won, but he had forgotten the lesson of the slow calculus. The system does not just erase, it adapts. The ledger was once again lost in transit. The digital files were corrupted by server errors, and the physical copies were seized as evidence in a fabricated legal dispute. The fire was once again under threat of being extinguished, not by water, but by the sheer crushing weight of institutional inertia. Malcolm realized that the war for the memory of Samuel Vance was moving into a new territory, one where the masks would be made of light and code. By the dawn of the third millennium, the battle for Samuel Vance's legacy migrated from the physical dust of archives into the ethereal architecture of the global network. The methods of the old league had been digitized, refined into a cleaner, invisible form of suppression. Control in the modern age no longer required the crude ritual of burning ledgers. It required the sophisticated art of algorithmic drowning. The system realized that truth doesn't need to be deleted if it can be buried under a mountain of irrelevant noise, entertainment, and manufactured outrage. This is the new mask, the illusion of abundance. In 2009, when researchers first uploaded grainy scans of the ledger to early forums, the response was a surgical digital erasure. Web pages vanished, links returned 404 errors, and the story was categorized as a fringe conspiracy. The goal was to induce a state of informational fatigue, where the effort to find the truth became so exhausting that the public simply settled for the comfort of the status quo. The fire wasn't out, it was just hidden behind a glowing blue wall of distraction. In 2028, a decentralized group of digital historians uncovered a document that the state had failed to scrub, a high-resolution scan of the ledger's final hidden page. It wasn't a list of names, but a conceptual diagram. A triangle divided into 3 layers: belief, behavior, and belonging. Samuel had sketched this model a century before modern psychology had a name for it. He understood that to control a man, you must first shape what he believes through information, then incentivize his behavior through rewards or punishments, and finally, anchor his sense of belonging through the fear of being ostracized. This triangle of control is the invisible blueprint of modern social architecture. It is how digital ecosystems manage consensus without ever appearing to exert force. By controlling the feed, they control the belief. By gamifying engagement, they control the behavior. And by creating echo chambers, they control the belonging. Samuel's ledger was more than a record of murder. It was an anatomy of the human mind under duress. To see the triangle is to see the cage, and for the first time in history, the cage was being mapped in real time. The final breakthrough came not through a court ruling, but through a global, decentralized leak that bypassed every gatekeeper on the planet. The ledger was encoded into the metadata of a seemingly innocuous historical archive, a digital ghost that could not be purged because it existed everywhere at once. Hidden in the binary was a recurring string of code that, when translated, revealed the familiar refrain: "The fire never dies, it only waits." This wasn't just a sentiment. It was a psychological trigger for a new generation that had begun to feel the tightening of the digital noose. They realized that the empathy and safety preached by modern platforms were often just the latest version of the white robes, virtue used as a shield for control. The Ash Brother had evolved into a symbol of perceptual mastery, a reminder that the most radical act of freedom is to refuse the script provided by those in power. The fire that had once consumed a wooden cross in a clearing was now a digital signal, flickering in the minds of those who had learned to see the strings behind the screen. As we stand in the present day, the story of Samuel Vance has reached its ultimate iteration. It is no longer a historical event to be debated, but a frequency to be tuned into. The masks have become so sophisticated that they are now internal. We police our own thoughts, we perform our identities for the algorithm, and we mistake our programmed reactions for authentic choice. Samuel's legacy is the cold, crystalline clarity that arrives when you stop looking at the mask and start looking at the man holding it. He proved that even a system built on centuries of terror can be dismantled if a single mind is patient enough to learn its language. The fire never died because the fire is awareness itself. It is the part of you that recognizes the patterns, that questions the consensus, and that refuses to let the dark define the light. Somewhere in the vast, unmapped reaches of the network, the ledger is still being read. Every time someone chooses truth over comfort, the flame flickers. Every time a mask is recognized for what it is, the darkness flinches. The war for the mind is eternal, but as Samuel taught us, no mask can hide a man from the truth he finally decides to see. The fire never dies. Never.